Welcome to the Performance Plastics Podcast, hosted by IAPD, the only podcast dedicated to providing you information and insights into the world of engineering-grade plastics and how they benefit society by improving the quality of everyday life. Now here's your host, Kylie Canty.
On this month's episode of the Performance Plastics Podcast, we have the owner of Colorado Plastics Products, who also happens to be a member of the IAPD Executive Committee. I'm so excited for you to listen to my conversation with Mr. Drew Schwartz. Drew,
good morning, everybody.
How are you doing?
Good, staying warm. It was about 3 degrees today when I came to work in Colorado, but yeah, so we don't always dress like we're getting ready for a Yellowstone episode here.
Yeah. Yes, it is also very cold in Kansas City. It was about 5 degrees this morning here. So I'm glad to hear that you're staying warm. But Drew, we can just dive on into it. Would you mind doing a brief introduction of yourself and, talking a little bit about your background?
Sure. I'm the owner of Colorado Plastics along with my wife. We bought it in 2005 from a gentleman who was in his late 70s. Whenever you buy a business, you always wonder what you don't know about the business. This gentleman's wife had 2 very serious health conditions, so he had to go take care of her. But previous to that, I had 2 other careers. My first career was in the laboratory business, which had a little bit to do with my family. I had physicians in the family, also had to do with a mentor of mine who was in the diagnostics business. So after getting the credentials to work in a human hospital laboratory and going to work at the veterinary school, University of Pennsylvania, this gentleman and I started a ClinPath laboratory for veterinarians. We did that for about 8 or 9 years. Actually had a sales rep. My first sales rep I ever hired wound up in the plastics business. Gentleman named Peter Shilgan, who still, I believe, is still a member of IAPD. He's a manufacturer's rep. He still lives in the county where I grew up in Pennsylvania, Chester County, Pennsylvania. After that, we sold it to some people from New York City, and I went back to business school. So in 1992, I went back and became a full-time student at Georgetown University. Was one of the oldest people in my class, which I definitely recommend. I would say the longer you work or the more experience you have and the more different experiences you have, the more you're going to get out of business school, if that's what you decide to do. It's not for everybody.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree.
And the more they're going to get out of you being there with them. So that was a totally positive experience. Very close with those people. I actually, at the beginning of the pandemic, started having bi-weekly, every 2 weeks, I do a Zoom call with whoever in my class wants to show up and just talk about what's going on in their life. So day before yesterday, I had about 10 of them on there. They tend to be overseas people. I don't know why. I think probably because those are the people that I most was interested in seeking out and keeping in touch with over the years. But we had a gentleman on there from Oman, guy from Calcutta in India, guy who works for Parliament in the UK. So I like to keep in touch. And I think even if you don't go to business school, the 2 biggest things I got out of it were the networking, as I described, the Zoom calls and wanting to maintain those relationships. But more than anything, I think in any master's program, they teach you how to learn. They teach you how to learn new things. I think as an undergraduate, they tend to focus on the facts and the body of knowledge and what you're supposed to, know. But I think in graduate school, it's much more up to you to decide what you're going to learn subject matter wise. But what that leads to is a method or a process for lifelong learning. So after business school, during business school, I spent the summer in between years in a place called Bratislava in what used to be Czechoslovakia, but became two separate countries in 1990. Did some interesting consulting projects there. Had started going there in 1990, went back in the summer of 93. Expected I would probably go there after graduation. But the situation had changed so much between 1990 to be a bootstrap entrepreneur, which is what I would have had to be, pay my own way with my own earnings, to 1993 when it had become much more of a formalized expense account, big time consulting arena. And I never wanted to be a management consultant. I always wanted to operate businesses. So I convinced my girlfriend, now wife of 25 years, in 1994 to move with me from DC to Boulder, Colorado, where we still live. And I fully expected to get a job in the life sciences. I had some, okay interviews with some life science companies you might have heard of, like Amgen, but I couldn't get a job doing that. So I met these guys. Oh, let me back up and say, one of the reasons I went to business school, or one of the purposes of going to business school, besides the networking and the learning how to learn more, better, was to learn about buying a business, or to think better about that, more procedurally. Yeah, one of the most influential books in my life that I ever read is called Barbarians at the Gate. And it was written about 1988. And it's when leveraged buyouts were kind of a new thing. And private equity was still a very new thing. It's a story about how these guys at a private equity firm that you might have heard of called Kohlberg, Kravis, and Roberts went and advised the guy that was running Nabisco to take the company private. It was a public company that people were making takeover attempts at, and the CEO knew that he was going to be, shown the door if there was a takeover. So they convinced him that they could issue enough debt in different markets to buy all the public stock back. Anyway, I didn't want to buy a public company. I just wanted to buy one from somebody that was operating one. So I wound up taking a job with these guys that were about 10 years older than me, that had a fancy building materials business called Wall Technology, kind of generic name, kind of sounds like a shaver company, but it's not that company. And I became the controller, and I showed them how a transaction would work and how they could retire and how I could, continue to operate the business in place. And I did such a good job showing them the nuts and bolts of how you sell your business that when the strategic buyer, which was a Fortune 500 company called Owens Corning, came along, they were ready to go. And worked out fine for me because Owens Corning offered about 2.5 times as much as I could ever scrape together, borrow, and so forth. And they were very generous to me and cut me in on a significant chunk of the difference between what I could have paid and what Owens Corning did pay. So I worked for them for 2 years, normal course of events. Worked for them as an executive for a couple of years, and they asked me what was the next job I wanted at Owens Corning, and I said, well, I don't really, want to move. And they said, well, that's too bad. If you're a good boy, we'll pay you some severance. So yeah, went traveling, came back, wrote an acquisition profile for a business to buy. Now it was my time to buy a business, and I went business hunting. And it took me about, oh gee whiz, 8 or 9 months after I came back. I probably wrote about 600 letters. I probably heard back from about 5 or 10% of the people I wrote the letters to.
Wow.
Explicitly told them I wasn't a broker. I wasn't going to flip their company. And a lot of them were guys that had no idea how to sell business. A lot of them are my customers now. But my banker called me one day and said, hey, Drew, Colorado Plastics is for sale. And I said, oh, great. I don't know anything about it. He said, well, here's Rich Rappaport's phone number. Rich is an active member of this association. He still operates a business with his sons, I believe, called Business Answers. And he and I worked out a deal for me to buy Colorado Plastics, and 15 years later, here we are.
Wow. That is such an extensive background and so much experience in traveling and different career paths. It amazes me that you originally started in life sciences and went back to get your MBA, and now, you're the owner of the Colorado Plastics. But, aside from, of course, having that, unfortunate turnout from all the businesses that you wrote to, and finally hearing back from one that was for sale, what made you want to go into plastics?
Well, I was going to say, one thing my wife teases me about is that I seem to be industry agnostic. There's a guy in IAPD named Alan Harari who likes to tell me at the cocktail parties that, Drew, I'm still looking for that person that decided they were going to work in plastics when they were trying to figure out, what they wanted to be when they grow up. And I said, well, other than the people whose fathers and grandfathers had plastics biz, you may be right. Mm-hmm. I think for me, it was the actual situation. Like I said, you don't always know why a business is for sale. I could understand why this one was for sale. It was a certain size. I wrote this acquisition profile, and it included things like, is it going to be solely retail, solely B2B, a mixture? I wanted a mixture. So we're about 3/4 B2B, about 1/4 retail. I didn't want a big customer concentration. Some people joke about selling to Walmart. No, I didn't want to have one customer that was going to have so much leverage over the business that it would be a problem if they were sold, or they decided, they're going to bring some of the stuff we do in-house. It needed to be a certain size. I don't have an unlimited checkbook. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to go spend a bunch of time raising money, and I didn't want to have a bunch of partners. So that's, and I also wanted it to be within a certain distance of where I live. Uh-huh. So that was the 600. There's about, I think I wrote to all the manufacturing companies in Boulder County and hereabouts, which was about 600. Yeah. Boulder County is about 400,000 people, and Front Range of Colorado is about 4 million people. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. The resilience.
I'm a firm believer it's more important to know what you're after than it is to be super excited and then flame out. So I knew it was going to take a while, and it did.
Mm-hmm. I have a question about, a lot of our Generation Next listeners who are earlier professionals or mid-career level professionals. When you first heard about Colorado Plastics, of course, was your initial thought like, ooh, single-use plastics, I don't want to be a part of that? Or did you kind of have an understanding? And when you're, introducing yourself to people and telling them what you do, how do you kind of navigate that question about like, oh, you work in plastics? Isn't that bad? Isn't that not sustainable? How do you switch that to explain performance plastics?
Well, one of the things that gives me instant street cred for people that know my wife is a professional environmentalist. My wife has worked for Environmental Defense Fund. When I met her, she was working for an offshoot of the Nature Conservancy called Conservation International, which is a rainforest conservation organization. She's worked for regional environmental groups here in Colorado, and now she works for the Nature Conservancy. So she's always worked for environmental groups that realize that business is the only force on the planet that can drive the kind of change that we need to change the amount of carbon dioxide that's being released into the air. Mm-hmm. So I think for me, of course, I was concerned about her opinion more than anybody else's, because she's my life partner. She's also my partner in the business. So I guess in a way, if I felt if I could convince her, I could convince anybody. And she's sort of my conscience that, okay, if you want to have a plastics business and you can continue to do the right stuff and treat people the right way. And oh yeah, we make stuff for, generating plants and, all sorts of cleanup activities and alternative energy, green energy, whatever you want to call it, sustainability. That would be fine. But yeah, it's important balance that we as an association and we as an industry run between being painted with the brush of single-use plastics and using plastic at all. Their book that I tell people, I like to read books. Okay, the book I tell people that are just starting out on their journey as to how harmful is plastic, how should I think about plastic, was written by a woman named Susan Freinkel. And Susan.
Oh, perfect.
Susan wrote this book called Plastic, a Toxic Love Story. And the idea of the book came from her wanting to figure out if it was possible to stop using plastic at all. Mm-hmm. So she wasn't just concerned with packaging materials or, single-use stuff. She wanted to see if she could go through her day without using plastic. And of course, it lasted till she turned on the light switch to brush her teeth in the morning.
Yeah.
But she goes through in a very interesting fashion what it's like, and she lives in San Francisco, mm-hmm. What it's like to deal with the fact that plastic's this great stuff that we're not going to be able to get rid of, and what's the most responsible, informed way to think about it. So yeah, I recommend that book very much. I just wrote a book review of a book about sustainability that I forget how this one was recommended, but this one's in the next issue of
that's
IAPD
actually
magazine,
the issue
value.
Live right now.
Yeah, and this one speaks to people that are more technically oriented. Julia Goldstein is a material scientist, PhD, who has worked in the plastics biz, has worked in metal, and she lays out a lot of the landscape of what it means to be sustainable and how we might think about that, not just as plastics people, but as responsible citizens trying to move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually just read that article in the digital publication for Performance Plastics. It's so interesting. Well, thank you for answering that question. I realize that it is kind of, when you first get into it, it can be sticky to explain, but you do have a leg up with having a wife who is an environmentalist.
Two other things I do, just real quick, do, little factoid things is one of my favorite things to say about plastic is, hey, it's too valuable to throw away. Uh-huh. We don't throw away plastic here. We upcycle it. So we have remnant sales and, give it away in ways that doesn't cannibalize our sales. The other thing is there were 2 times in history, another book, there were 2 times in history when plastic was actually very beneficial to the environment. The one time, and this is a book called Plastic, the Making of a Synthetic Century. And these are some really cool stories. They're almost like magazine articles about different families of plastic, how they came about. And one of the first ones was called phenolic, actually celluloid before phenolic. And it was developed without an application until they realized that it could replace billiard balls. So about 140 years ago, they stopped using, elephant tusks to put on pool tables to play pool and started making those out of plastic. The other time I tell people that, plastic became very useful was talking about throwing stuff away after the Second World War, when we started driving more and the economy was booming and everybody was buying a new car. A byproduct of gasoline from crude oil is polyethylene. So there were all these new feedstocks for all these new plastics. So when you read this book or some other books, you'll see that a lot of these engineering plastics, performance plastics that we sell through IAPD were developed in the 50s because of all the chemistry that came about, because they had all this refining fractions to do something with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't wait to put all these book recommendations in our description for the podcast episode. I think it's so valuable to have that information. But what book are you reading right now, if you don't mind to share?
Today, the book I'm reading is a book called Stuff Matters. So one of the things I like to do is, and I can't pronounce this gentleman's last name, but when I talked to Dr. Goldstein about material value, she recommended this book. This one actually compares a lot of different materials, including plastic, to things like metal, sand, a variety of different materials. This gentleman, Mark, I think his name's pronounced Miodovich, is a material scientist too. And the other thing, back to this question of how, as a young person, trying to be responsible, having to contend with their peer group that's in many ways more oriented towards sustainability than my generation might have been, is to think about, okay, plastic's got these drawbacks, plastic's got these benefits. What are the drawbacks of wood? What are the drawbacks and benefits of metal?
Mm-hmm.
What are the drawbacks and benefits of concrete? They all glass. Glass uses a lot more energy to produce than plastic.
Mm-hmm.
Sand is not a infinite resource in the world. One thing I didn't know until I read this book was the sand in the desert's not suitable for concrete. So there are people that are, stealing sand in river basins in Asian and African countries to sell to people that want to make concrete. So it's not just conflict diamonds, it's conflict sand too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Conflict wood, conflict materials.
Yeah.
So interesting. Well, kind of going back to being a young, professional in this industry, is there a piece of advice that you wish you could have given yourself when you just started out in the plastics business that would have helped you? Maybe, I know that mistakes are great and we have to fail to learn and everything, but is there a piece of advice that you would have liked to give yourself just starting out?
Yeah, everybody says make mistakes as fast as you can. That's fine. But this one actually goes back to the laboratory business, but I have 2 new employees this week that I've used this with multiple times. There's something I think about as the 400 questions, and 400 is just a made up number, but I think it's plus or minus, 50%, let's say. When the phone rings and you answer it, which is really important. So that's my number 1 piece of advice is answer the phone. Don't be afraid of the phone. When you answer the phone and somebody has a question that you don't know the answer to, at the beginning, it's very daunting to think about, oh, should I know the answer to that question? And the way I think about that is, it's important to know whether you should know the answer to that question, because if you don't know the answer to that question, which is one of the 400, let's call them, you're potentially losing credibility with the customer. If you don't know the answer, if it's a question that you have no reason to know the answer to, and you're confident of that,
mm-hmm.
you can make points with the customer by explaining to them what an unusual question that is, how happy you are that they asked you that question, and how long in a reasonable, believable time frame it's going to take you to get the answer to the question.
Mm-hmm.
So my advice is figure out what the 400 questions are for your part of our industry and get some expert to explain to you, okay, should I have a notebook? Should I read these books? Should I just follow you around? Should I watch YouTube videos? I love YouTube videos. One of my favorite things to do with people that are migrating to new job responsibilities, or just trying to fix something or figure out what somebody's, asking us to quote in our fab shop is YouTube. But yeah, think about what the questions are that you really should know the answers to, and think about how you're going to respond to people that ask you a question that you have every reason to believe is something that you have every right to take your time and do some research to get back to them about.
Mm-hmm. That is fantastic advice. Answer the phone and be ready for questions. I love what you
don't be
said.
afraid of questions. The way to
Yeah.
not be afraid of, when you're new, you're afraid of questions. You're
Uh-huh.
afraid to say, I don't know.
Uh-huh.
And it's okay to say, it's always okay to say, I don't know, but it's a lot more convincing to say, I don't know, if you know that it's something that you don't necessarily have a reason to know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Absolutely. What great advice for somebody that's just starting out. And it's okay to not know all the answers, and that's how you learn too.
Mm-hmm.
And doing your own research and figuring out what works for that specific, region.
And you'll know what they are. And the other thing about that idea is it gets you past that first 3 months when you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah.
It's a way of getting into that second 3 months and third 3 months and on to a year, where I think most people after about 12 months, they firmly know what they don't know. So I guess that's another way of describing the 400 questions is, figuring out what you don't know.
Mm-hmm. And you don't know what you don't know. Yep.
And in the beginning, you don't know what you don't know. Mostly don't know what you don't know. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So being so experienced and being, a member of the executive committee, how did you even get involved with IAPD in the first place?
Well, I think it's important that if you're going to be a professional, and have a professional attitude and be a career person in a specific industry, to be a member of the trade association. I think it signifies something to do that. I also think it's important to figure out the shortcuts, to figure out what other people already know that may not be obvious to you. And I guess we're back to, why would anybody get an MBA? Well, you would get an MBA to have a solid network, and you'd get an MBA to figure out, what the subject matter experts are in a given field. Mm-hmm. So, through IAPD, I have a great network. I used to listen to people say, these people aren't just my competitors or my suppliers or my customers, they're my friends. But that's true. Initially, I got involved because of this question of, how do I justify selling plastics? I live in a place that's, very socially progressive, sort of like San Francisco, Berkeley, some other college towns around the country that try to, be at the cutting edge of social change, and particularly in Colorado, environmentalism. I don't know if you guys know, but Colorado is the only place in the world that's ever been awarded an Olympic Games. And then the populace decided we weren't going to do it. And the primary reason was environmental impact. In 1976, the International Olympic Committee awarded Denver the Winter Olympics. And the governor said, I'm not sure the people really want to do this. And we had a referendum and the Olympics went to Innsbruck, Austria. So I came into IAPD through the Environmental Committee because I wanted to see and make sure that we were on the right track when it comes to all the different aspects of sustainability, including recycling and efficient energy use in our facilities. And I went on from there to different parts of the organization. I began attending the convention. I became interested in, or I learned about the other parts of the organization, like the membership committee, like the marketing committee. And more lately, I've become very interested in something called the Small Distributor Roundtable. More than half of our distributor members, or around half of our distributor members, are less than $50 million in sales. Mm-hmm. So if you're less than $50 million in sales, you're eligible for a particular group called the Small Distributor Roundtable. Made some really good friends there. It's ironic because if you know the history of IAPD, you know that it was originally started as a small distributor reaction to some consolidation, some larger holding companies buying up independent distributors and creating chains. And that continues. Mm-hmm. Both those things continue. The small distributors continue to be a very significant number of our members. And of course, competition leads to people capitalizing businesses as chains. So yeah. Mm-hmm. And the other thing I'm very interested in, back to the single-use plastic question, IAPD has our own people in Washington that look out for our best interests. And one of those is making sure that when it comes to bills in Congress, that we don't get written into them as people that are going to be regulated the same way that single-use plastic people are, because we're not the guys that create plastic pollution, which I consider to be single-use plastics. So I've become more active on the government relations committee as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a fantastic point too. And going back to the book you recommended about how, somebody tried to go throughout her whole day without using plastics. And like you said, she couldn't even make it without brushing her teeth or turning on the light switch. Like, it really is a part of our everyday life. And it is so valuable, like you said, and is pretty much your motto. Well, thank you so much for sitting down and answering these questions so thoughtfully. Is there, any last minute Hail Marys that you would like to kind of send out to any of our early career professionals? Any advice?
I would just say, if you're hesitant about whether or not you should get involved with IAPD, give me a call, send me an email. But simpler than that, just show up at one of these functions, and I can pretty much guarantee that you'll meet enough people, kindred spirits, that'll make your life less lonely when you're feeling about, oh, should I be in this plastics thing? But also, like a lot of other things in life, you get out what you put in.
Absolutely.
And just showing up is the most important thing. So even if you don't find your niche committee, you're welcome to sit in committee meetings. You don't have to join a committee. You can sit in, it's like picking a church. If you want to go to different committee meetings and see, who's running the committee, who's in the committee, what's being discussed, you're welcome to do that stuff too. So yeah, just show up and see what you think. And if you have any questions, I'm always happy to talk to anybody. The other thing I was going to say was, besides the 400 questions, my way of doing business is to try and help people, even if I don't do what they're calling about. So I always have a very thick folder full of referrals on my desk. And just to make sure I remember what's in it, I flip through it once a month just to think about, oh yeah, here's where I send some, or here's where I can have somebody call if they need a cover for their window well. Oh yeah, here's where I can have somebody call if they need plastic barrels, or here's where I can have somebody call if they want to buy a bajillion credit cards. And people really appreciate that.
That's fantastic that you do that, just to really help level up everybody in this, in IAPD.
And I also refer them to IAPD members that do stuff that we don't do. So yeah, if you're not sure if you're in my referral folder, IAPD members, give me a call. I'll talk to you about it.
If you're not sure, then you probably are.
It could be. No, there's plenty of IAPD members that do the same thing. I actually got the idea from some people at Port Plastics in Denver once upon a time. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I hope we'll be seeing you at the annual convention in September in Tampa.
We'll be there. Anita's coming. She loves Florida.
Oh, fantastic.
I'll be there for sure. Kylie, thank you for doing this, and welcome to IAPD. And I hope you have lots of fun doing some more of these.
Thank you so much, Drew. Thank you for popping on here. You're a valuable resource to us.
Welcome.
Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. See you later.
Bye.
This podcast was brought to you by the International Association of Plastics Distribution. For more information on IAPD, please visit our website at www.iapd.org.